So now that John has given a broad overview of the muscle setup, we are ready to go into more step-by-step detail for each node. I've also switched from the capybara to this minotaur model as it has more complex muscles, which will be better suited to our needs. Now, the first thing we want to do is to make sure that our geometry is prepared correctly for the muscle simulation. So let's start off by reading in the muscle model. Typically, what you will do in a production situation is you will read a static muscle model from disk, either as a USD file or an Alembic file, perhaps FBX or BGO, and that depends on your personal preferences. But I will just show you some gotchas for those of you who are new to Houdini. If you read in an Alembic file, you will see we clicked on the info pane here. We have 49 points, 49 primitives, and down here it shows that those 49 primitives are packed alembics. Now, packed alembics are very fast to read, but they are not particularly useful for simulating. So what we want to do is we want to get these into polygon form. And so the best way to do that is with an unpack node. Now, if you're reading in a USD file, you'll want to use unpack USD instead, or unpack USD to polygons. But for alembics, just unpack should be good. And now you'll see that we have 13,000 and something points and primitives, and the primitives are of type polygon. So that is excellent. That is what we need. However, you might have a case where the alembic was created by a different software. You might still not have everything in polygonal form. And in that case, you'll want to add a convert node after your unpack, and that will convert them to polygons. And then you should be good to go. So that is the first crucial step, is to read in your geometry and make sure that it is in polygonal form. The next step is to make sure that your model is in scales of meters, because many other software packages use centimeters as their default scale, whereas Houdini uses meters. And if you don't scale down your model, the simulation will behave as if it is a giant. So let's go into the front view with spacebar 3. And with the grid on, I've got something else displayed. So let me just hit spacebar F to frame the muscles. And we can see that this is 200 meters tall, which is definitely not what we want. We want him to be about 2 meters tall. So I'm going to drop down a transform node, connect that up, and to convert from centimeters to meters, we're going to set the uniform scale to 0.01. Now it looks like it's disappeared, but it's actually just down there. So if I hit spacebar F again, it will frame in on the model, and we will see that it is now 2 meters tall, which is perfect. Let me just remind you that if the rest of your production pipeline is working in centimeter units, you will probably want to scale your final result back up again before you export it. So then you will put down another transform node right at the end of everything before your whatever type of file caching you want to do. And you will set your uniform scale to 100, and then that will scale it back up to the original scale that it was. All right, I will go back into perspective with spacebar 1. And now let's look at our bones. So for our rest bones, we also want to make sure that it is in the correct scale, as well as being polygons. Oh yes, one thing I wanted to add, don't get confused by these being stash nodes. Basically, in a production environment, you would use something like this. What I have done is I've created a stash node after I read my file in like this. You see it's empty by default when you create it. When you click stash input, it will take whatever it's reading from disk here and save it into the file. It's important to know that in Houdini, when you're reading in a file, it's not saving it into the HIP file by default. It's always just pointing to disk and loading it into memory as it reads it. But if you want to actually save it into the file, you use a stash node and click stash input. Now, most of the time you would not do that. The only reason I'm doing that is because I'm sharing this file online where it's easier to not have to worry about having a lot of external files along with the HIP file to pass along. But if you're on a shared network in a studio or something, you will probably just read in files from disk. So that is the logic behind why I have these stash nodes here. Okay, so back to the bones. So the bones need to have a T-pose attribute. Now the muscles will eventually also get a T-pose attribute, but they will be created automatically by the muscle nodes. But the bones need to have the T-pose attribute created manually. So the way you do this is if you press Tab and go to Character Effects, Muscles, you will see that there is a Set T-pose option as well as an Extract T-pose option. So let's start with the Set T-pose. You'll notice this is actually creating a node called Rest Position, but the Set T-pose is an alias for the Rest Position node with the Rest attribute already set to the name that is expected by the muscle nodes, which is T-pose. When you create just a plain Rest Position node, the default name for the Rest attribute is Rest. It's completely fine to create a Rest attribute node and manually change this to T-pose. If I can see my keyboard. But this alias is just a helper for you to do it quickly. Okay. So what this does is it takes whatever incoming position, which is the P value. The position is saved as a P point value into that P attribute. And what this does is it takes whatever value is incoming in the P attribute and saves it to an attribute called T-pose. And if we even look in the geometry spreadsheet, we will see that the T-pose attribute and P attribute match. Let's look at our bone animation. So don't worry about the bone animation, how I've set this up. We just need to assume that you will have bone animation coming in some form. In this case, because I've used the rest attribute and deformed it, the rest bones, and deformed it to create my animation, I already have a T-pose attribute. But let's say you're in a situation where your bone animation is coming in without a T-pose attribute. Firstly, let me just add that your bone animation and your T-pose bones, your rest bones, should be blend shapeable. Their point order must match. But now, let's say you have some type of animation and we need to set the T-pose attribute. So I'm going to say set T-pose. Now, in this case, we have animated bones. So we don't want to set the animation to the T-pose. That's contrary to what one would expect. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the rest bones, we're going to pipe it in as the second input. And what it will do when there is a second input connected is it will save the p-value of the second input into the T-pose attribute instead. So now we've created a T-pose attribute that is containing positional value of the second input, even though the first input is dynamic. Now, I mentioned earlier there's also the extract T-pose. Now, what the extract T-pose does, it's also an alias for the rest position node, but here the mode is set to extract rest. So what this does is it does the reverse. So instead of saving the p-value into T-pose, it's going to take the existing T-pose value and replace the p-value with that T-pose value. So now you see it has removed the animation. The normals are still animating, but the p-value has been replaced with the static rest pose p. So that's just to explain what these two nodes do. In my case, however, my animation already has a T-pose attribute, so I don't need to worry about this. But now we need to think about our pre-roll for the bones. If you're lucky and you work in a pipeline where animation is exported with a pre-roll for you, then that's great and you don't need to worry about this. But that's not always the case. So let's have a look at this nifty little node and how it can help you. So firstly, for your muscle pre-roll, you want to set your mode to blend into sequence. When a parameter is bold like this, it means it's not set to the default value. So the default value is hold, but instead we want to set it to blend into sequence. Next, we'll see this T-pose tab also is not set to default, and that's because we've set it to use the attribute instead of initial frame, because our initial frame on the animation isn't in the T-pose. So instead we're going to say use from attribute, and the attribute will be called T-pose. Now let's go to the main tab, the first tab. The initialization frame is the first frame of your animation or the last frame of your pre-roll. So basically the pose that you want to grab from the incoming animation, which you want to be the last frame of your pre-roll. Or we can, let's say, the target pose. So here I've used frame 11 because in this case I set up the animation to start at frame 11. If you have got animation before frame 11, the pre-roll will just ignore it. Okay, so I want my pre-roll to start, my pre-roll to end essentially on this frame. The initial hold is the last frame at which you want the T-pose to be held at. So all frames before this frame will be on the T-pose, including this one, and then from there on, it will start blending to the initialization frame pose, and the number of frames that that blend occurs over is going to be determined by the pre-roll duration. So as you can see with this, we're going to have it blend from T-pose into that initialization frame, and then the animation continues. Now I just want to point out something important. If I template this incoming animation so that we can compare the incoming animation to the pre-roll, we see this matches perfectly, and then obviously, as we'd expect, for the pre-roll part, it will differ from the incoming. But say you want to increase your initial hold, right? So what we have now is that we have until frame 5, we have the T-pose being held, and then we're going to have 10 frames of pre-roll, but then that will overshoot our initialization frame. So now our animation will no longer match the incoming animation after the initialization frame. So to prevent that, you need to make sure that these two numbers added together plus 1 adds up to the initialization frame. So that means that if you want to give it an initial hold of 5 and you still want your animation to start on frame 11, your pre-roll duration needs to decrease to 5 frames. So now the animation lines up and we have a pre-roll of 5 frames here and a hold up to frame 5 here. So it's just important to note that this is a frame number, this is a number of frames, this is a frame number. Let's show this in a more typical frame range for production. So here I have my animation starting on frame 1001. Okay, so what I want to do, let's look at it here. What I want to do is I want to have my pre-roll start on frame 990. So I will set my initial hold to frame 990. That's the last frame that I want it to be on the T-pose. And I just realized I made a little mistake here when this was 0 and 10. This isn't strictly speaking the T-pose. So just be aware of that. I would either have to change this to 0 or increase this to frame 1 and reduce this to 9, just to get it to be more accurate. But coming back to this one, so in this case, my animation is starting on frame 1001. My initial hold is frame 990. So that's the last frame that I want it to be at T-pose, spacebar F to frame it. And then I'm going to let the pre-roll last for 10 frames so that this plus this is 1,000 and then plus 1 equals that. So that is perfect. Now it should line up. Great. And you'll see if I increase this, no longer lines up. So this we will have to reduce to 6 to compensate. All right. So the more, if your initialization frame is locked, essentially, if you want to add a longer pre-roll, you will have to reduce your start frame numbers here. Okay, let's go back to the original file. And now we have our bones with a pre-roll. You can turn this template off. Now let's make sure that our muscles are correctly named. Now, the important thing for the muscle names is that the muscle nodes expects the name to be stored as an attribute called muscle_ID. And here, looking at my incoming attributes, I see that I have a name attribute, but I don't have a muscle ID attribute. Now, in this case, where there is a name attribute, that's great. I can just very easily create a muscle ID from the name attribute. And to do this, I'm not going to use a muscle ID node. Okay, it's very important. You only need to use the muscle ID node if you don't have any names incoming on your geometry. It doesn't matter what the name of the attribute is that stores the name, but if there is some form of name coming in, you can use that. And I will show you how. The easiest way is to use an attribute copy, and you just connect both inputs to the same incoming geometry. And what it will do is it will copy an attribute from the geometry to itself, but you can tell it to give it a new name. So I will use the name attribute. I will give it a new name when I copy it, and I will call it muscle_ID. Now this little warning here isn't too important, but I'll just change my group types to primitives because my attributes are primitive attributes. So now, if we look at the info, we'll see that the name attribute still exists, but now there's this new attribute, and we know it's new because it's bold here, and it is muscle ID. And in the geometry spreadsheet, in the primitives tab, we can see that these two match. So now we have a muscle ID, and that's perfect. We don't need to do anything else. If you have a name that's coming in a different form, perhaps as a path attribute, where you'll need to do a bit more editing to extract the name from it, I will have a separate video in the advanced topics to cover that, but I don't want to get too sidetracked now, so I will leave that for a separate video. But now let's say we're in a situation where we don't have any incoming name attribute whatsoever. Now this is a situation where we will want to use a muscle ID node. Okay, so I'm going to create it. Oh, I just want to also show sometimes if you create it and it's not connected, you'll get an error. And the best way to get rid of that error is just to hit Control-C. It didn't really happen properly in this case, but sometimes it happens for some of the other muscle nodes, and then it's useful to know just hit Control-C will get rid of that error. It's just a stashing error. So what we want to do is we want to enter the viewport state for this node. Now, all the muscle nodes have viewport states. So to do that, you select the node, you move your cursor to the viewport, and you hit enter. So now you'll see this has come up. This is the group selector. And normally, when you're not in a viewport state that brings it up, you can either bring it up with the 9 key or with this button here. But seeing as it's part of the viewport state for this node, it will come up by default with the correct setting. So now when you're in this viewport state, you can just select a muscle, hit enter, and this will pop up so that you can rename it. Now, the only requirement for naming is that muscles on the left side need to start with L underscore and muscles on the right side need to start with R underscore. And the default is going to assume that it's uppercase L and uppercase R. You can change it, but I will just stick to the default for simplicity's sake. So L underscore pectoralis major sternal. So I've just abbreviated this a bit so that in situations where there's not a lot of space to see the name, it doesn't cut off. Okay, so now we see that it's showing up as piece 15 still, but as soon as I move my mouse, it will update. So now you can see the name of this muscle and it's shown up here. You can also select from this list instead of from the geometry itself. So let's say I want to do this one. Hit enter, L pectoralis major. This is the clavicular part. And so on and so forth. I can go in and rename all my L muscles. Now for muscles that are in the central line that don't have corresponding left and right muscles, there is no standard convention that's expected, but I like to use capital C underscore to make it easier to group later on if I need to. So select that, hit C, and now these other two central muscles are not really proper muscles, but let me quickly talk about them. I'm going to use Control click on the template of the rest bones so that they display as properly shaded instead of in wireframe mode when they're templated. But basically the idea here is that we don't want empty gaps between muscles and bones where the muscles can collapse. So this volume here is just there as a placeholder to stand in for all the organs and visceral fat that are located in the belly cavity, as it's a waste to have it all broken up separately. It's much simpler to just have one muscle volume stand in, because we're only really interested in the superficial muscles, right? Because those are the ones right under the skin. And so those are the ones that we will be seeing. But things under those superficial muscles can be a lot simpler. So I'm just going to call this one, because it doesn't correspond to an actual name, I'm just going to call this C belly cavity. And then this one over here, it's a bit of a cheat. This trapezius should have been a bit thicker actually to make up for more of this volume. But again, it's just to fill in some of that volume so that these muscles don't collapse. So it's just a simplification of what's normally in this region. And I'll just call it C neck filler. And now I've named my central muscles. I accidentally exited the viewport state because I'm using a mouse I'm not used to, but we're back in it now. And while we're here, while I was talking about these sort of stand-in volume filling muscles, I'm also going to talk about the bone geometry a bit, in that you'll notice the rib cage is a solid mesh instead of individual rib bones. And that is just to simplify it. Number one, the fewer points you have in your bone collision mesh, the faster your sim will run, because every point in your sim is going to look at every point in the collision mesh. So the more points there are, the longer the collision detection will take. So simplifying your bones is going to save a lot of sim time. And also the fewer high detail cavities and crevices there are in your bones, the less your danger there is for the muscles to get trapped in funny holes. But if you would like some of that nice surface detail of the ribs, you can always use a volume like this, but with the rib profile sculpted in. And you can see in general, the other bones have been simplified a fair amount. And you could probably even take it a bit further. Many people suggest removing patellas. You probably don't need all your hand bones, etc. Okay, so now let's talk about symmetry a bit. So I mentioned that the convention is to use L underscore for your left muscles. So you can see here for each muscle that I named, it's created a new tab. If you make a typo, you can go and edit it here afterwards and that will update. You can also delete any of these if you're not happy with them. But let's say we want to mirror our muscles, which we typically will if we only have one side to begin with. So I will create a muscle mirror node. Typically we'd create this later down in the workflow, but I'm just going to put this down now to demonstrate how the naming mirror works. So firstly, I'll show a handy little trick with why I like to use the C underscore for the central muscles. If we select one of these central muscles as our group, and I'm going to replace everything after C underscore with an asterisk, also known as a wildcard, which means anything matching the pattern C underscore. But now instead of saying equal to, we want it to be everything that's not equal to this. So to do that, we put in an exclamation mark before the equal sign. So now this is saying muscle ID not equal to C underscore fill in wildcard pattern. So now if I hit enter, you will see it has mirrored everything except these central muscles. You'll see what happens is, let's find some muscles that have actually been named here. So now you can see that it's gone from all the L underscore pectoralis, it has now changed to R underscore pectoralis. So the muscle mirror will pick up the prefixing. Of course, if you had the right side that you're mirroring, you would change it to R underscore, and if perhaps it's lowercase r instead of uppercase R, you would do that. If you wanted L underscore, you would do it that way. Undo. Whoops. But now let's say we have our left and right muscles there to begin with. So let me just create a muscle mirror on the original muscles. And now I don't have anything named, so I can't use the names in the group. So instead, I'm just going to have to select them and Control to deselect what I don't want. Hit enter. So now this is mirrored. So now if I use the muscle ID node, and so just to be clear, in this case, I've mirrored it, but perhaps your muscles are slightly asymmetric. It will still work with this. So I'm going to select this. And just for speed's sake, I'm just going to make this LPEC. And now you'll see this says LPEC, this says RPEC. So it has automatically renamed the corresponding muscle on the other side and replaced the L with R. And you can see the pink color shows that that muscle's been renamed, and the purple color shows that that is the automatically renamed mirroring muscle. So that is how the muscle ID works with symmetry. And again, if you don't want to use capital L and R, you can change these, or if it's right to left, you can swap those. Similarly, we want to make sure that our bones are named, and there's no preset for the bone name attribute, but I like to use bone underscore ID. If you have an attribute already coming in, that's great. You can just use it as is. Maybe it's a name, you can just use it. But let's say you're in a situation where you don't have any names. You can use the muscle ID node on the bones too. Now, okay, this is a case where the error isn't going away, so I'm just going to hit Control C and it will get rid of it. Now, in theory, you can change this to a different attribute name. I did have some issues with this, so I think it's safer to just use this as muscle ID first and then change that afterwards. So I'm just going to type whatever because I'm not really paying attention right now. But what you can do is you can do an attribute rename. You can also do an attribute copy. I'm just showing it a different way. Make sure you're in the primitive tab. And now you're going to go from muscle ID to, and it doesn't matter what this is, but I like to use bone ID. But I do actually already have a bone ID attribute, so I'm just going to call it bone ID new. And now you will see that there's this bold attribute, so it's new, bone ID new, and the muscle ID attribute has gone away. So the difference between the attribute copy and the attribute rename is the attribute copy will keep the name and just duplicate it with the new name, and the attribute rename will change the name and thereby removing the old name. Okay, so that is how you can create a bone ID. Just delete these because I already have a bone ID. There is one last thing that we want to do before we can start properly setting up our muscles for simulation, and that is to ensure that there are no intersections between the muscles as well as between the muscles and the bones. Now, why don't we want these intersections? Strictly speaking, Vellum can handle points that are intersecting on the first frame of the simulation, in the sense that it doesn't cause them to explode like something like FEM might, but it does this by disabling collisions on the intersecting points from the first frame onwards. And this can have some unintended consequences, such as if you have intersections between your muscles and your bones, you can often get gloopy looking muscles. And if you have intersections between muscles and muscles that are quite large, if the intersection area is quite large, then I've seen that the muscle to muscle constraints don't always get created correctly in that area. Another thing to look out for is if you have a quadruped, for instance, so it's a bit hard to show it here, but a quadruped will typically have in a rest position, the back leg will be quite close to the abdomen. And if you have the leg muscles penetrating the muscles of the abdomen, then as that leg swings backwards, you can have stretching and pulling of the muscles if they're penetrating. So those are some of the reasons why we want to do a check to make sure that our muscles have no intersections. Now, I will do an advanced video to show how to actually fix intersections, but for this video, I just want to show how you can check for them, and you can use that to either kick back a muscle model to a modeling department, or you can, if the problems are small enough, you can maybe fix them with some small sculpts or edits. And I recommend the sculpt tool if you are not familiar with that new node in 20.5. So for checking, I have created this subnet. It's not a node yet. It might become one in future versions of Houdini, but for now I just left it as a subnet so that it's very easy to share. And if you want to turn it into an HDA, go ahead. So the first input is going to be the muscles, and the second input is the bones. And then you'll see there are 3 outputs, which I've merged together just for display reasons. The first output is going to be, they're going to be colored spheres to show where the intersections are. If you don't have any intersections, you won't see anything. Second output is going to be muscles. Third output will be bones. And so I have already ensured that this model is clean and without any intersections. But let's just add some back in. So I'll put down a peak node. I'm going to set the distance to 0.01. And now we see these spheres pop up. So there are 3 colors. The orange is for muscle to muscle intersections, and that is between separate muscles. You can, for all of these, you can change the color, you can change the radius, you can change the intensity if you want it to glow more, and you can also change your muscle opacity and your bone opacity. So these will show where the muscles are penetrating one another. The next one, the muscle self-intersections, are showing where there are faces or points from one part of the muscle penetrating another part of the same muscle. So there's this option here, display as points, which will display the spheres as points instead, just so that when you're zooming in, it's a bit easier to see. It's not, the actual geometry isn't completely obscured by the spheres. And this will be useful if you just wanted to go in and maybe use a sculpt a little smooth to get rid of that. But I will add that the self-intersections aren't as critical to resolve as the muscle-to-muscle or muscle-to-bone ones are. Your muscle solidify will often get rid of that for you. Basically, it will get rid of it if you aren't doing a remesh separately beforehand. If you just use the remesh inside the muscle solidify, it will fix any self-intersections. But you just need to be careful because that can change the shape of the muscle a little bit in that area. So this option is added so that you can flag it ahead of time and fix it if you want to have more control over the final shape. And then lastly, there are the muscle to bone intersections. I'll turn the display as points off and you can see them as spheres. And I'll also show here in the info pane, let me turn all of these on. And you can see that each of these have a corresponding group, muscle to bone, self-intersecting, muscle to muscle. And you can see that it shows how many points there are. Now these points are just, it doesn't correspond to points on the actual geometry. It's points created by the intersection detection. So there are going to be more points typically than there are intersections. But if you have 0 for all of these, then you know you are intersection free and you can happily continue with setting up your simulation. One final thing I just want to mention is this is a little bit slow, and because it's doing things like editing the opacity just for display reasons, I wouldn't use any of the output of this for downstream calculations in the sim. Just keep this off to the side and carry on working in your main stream here for any further steps. You can, of course, if you had a situation where you made edits, you can, for instance, put down a sculpt node before and the input will update as you, or you can keep this displayed, but select that and enter the viewport state for your selected sculpt node or whatever. I'm just going to turn off that. And what you can do now is, let's say we want to fix the self-intersection here. So I will use smooth, maybe reduce the strength, and you can see it updates. It's not the fastest. It's a bit of a slow update, but you can see the results of your tweaks in real time, almost real time. So then once you're happy with that, you can carry on working downstream from here and leave this off to the side. All right, in the next video, we will start solidifying the muscles for simulation.